Okay, so this is the SneakyKitty Games Shooter Frameworks example project. You can only run this project if you have the plugin. It will look for the plugin either in the plugins folder or in your engine folder, plugins folder. But I wanted to show what this is and why we're doing this, because I get the impulse to want to make your own game and start from scratch and do everything on your own. I get that. But this developer has developed this plugin that is, like, in my opinion, one of the best first-person shooter plugins on the marketplace. And it has just an incredible amount of functionality built into it, on the C++ side, replicated, optimized, and the developer is super active. So the Discord, he's answering questions, he's adding functionality that the community is requesting, and so it's an active development plugin that is production level code ready to go. So I just wanted to show why we're using it for that reason. So this is his example project. So I'm just going to just play this real quick, and you can see kind of what we're going to kind of get from the example. So you can see the movement stuff is pretty basic, because that's not its focus. Its focus, however, is the procedural aiming. You can see weapon sway. You can see all of the leading, the sway, the rotation sway, all that stuff. This is happening per firearm. In each firearm can set its own data assets for that. You can see that it has procedural high port and low port, and it has all of the scope functionality built into it: optics, reticles, switching firearms, switching shoulders, and all of that stuff is kind of just built into this super modular C++ backend. Thousands of lines of C++ code that, yes, you could write yourself, but in a way, like, in my opinion, there's no need to when the code is this good. So that's why we're integrating Lyra with this framework, and leveraging this to make the game that we're making. Okay, so there's my 2-point sales pitch for why this is what we're using, and it's saving us just tons of time for the kind of functionality that we're getting from it, and so that's why we're using it. Okay, so there you go. So now how are we going to use it is the question, and what we need to do from this is we basically just need to migrate the SneakyKitty Games Shooter Framework folder over into our folder. Okay, so just take the whole thing and let's find our project. Here it is, and just go to the content folder, right? Standard migration, content folder, select folder, and let's just migrate the whole thing over there. Okay. So once that is done, we'll have that in our content folder, and that's fine. We can leave it there. There's no reason for us to move it into our plugin folder, because we're going to use things from it. However, we may want it to relate to other parts of our plugin, and I'm just going to go ahead and close this out. And so if we go back to our content browser, you can see that it's now here. Okay. So this is all the content we just had, and the reason we migrated it over is because we don't want to recreate things that we don't have to recreate, and because the plugin is so modular, it comes with its own NMBP, okay, which is very basic, but gives you the overview of what we were talking about. Here's that layered blend per bone with the locomotion stuff coming into this, and then the upper body procedural stuff happening here, right? So, but what it does have, I'm just going to close that out. What it does have is it has this this procedural anim layer, and we just saw that we can leverage these procedural, and this is a very complex procedural anim layer that has direct links to the C++ code on the back end, so it's very optimized and replicated. And so we don't have to recreate all of this in order to get what we want. We can just use this because we do have the plugin installed in Lyra. Okay, so we can use this as our own within within our own project. Okay. Okay, so here are the two procedural animation blueprints that we need to get into our project from the Sneaky Kitty Games shooter frameworks file structure. And I'm copying these over into the linked layers folder from the Lyra base game because we have to reassociate this anim BP with our skeleton. So I've already done that, so I'm going to go here and show you what I did. So I copied those into from there, from um, the Sneaky Kitty Game Shooter Framework example project to the linked layers folder of Lyra's base game. They're here now, and I renamed them my game with underscore my game at the end. So now these are both the same as they were before, except they're renamed, and this anim layer, procedural anim layer, I assigned our skeleton to it. So you can just, you don't need to retarget this. Since they're both using the UE5 skeleton, you can just assign the same skeleton that you're using elsewhere, which is this SK mannequin skeleton in the game characters heroes mannequin meshes folder. You'll see other skeletons here. Don't use the UE4 skeleton. Use the UE5 skeleton that you're using across the board. Okay, so I already did that, so that's here. Okay, so then how do these layers get kind of interfaced together? I'll show you that right now. So what we need to do is go back to our AVP item anim layers base, and under class settings, and I've already done this as well, you have already the ALI item anim layers interface, animation layer interface, item anim layers. But what you need to do is add the one you just copied that's linking the procedural layers into your um, into your item anim layers base NMBP, the one we're in now. So you just add that here, okay? So since I've already added it, you won't see the name here in the list, but just add it through this list here. Once you do that, you'll see that the atom layers, procedural layers, is now available here for you within this AVP item layers base. You'll also see that you'll need to do that here in your primary anim BP, the AVP mannequin base, which is now yours, right? The my game one. And if you look in class settings, you need to do the same thing here. You need to add the implemented interfaces for that one. So this is now linking to this, and this is linking to this, except we haven't done that here yet. So that's what we need to do now, and there's a step we need to I need to show you in order to get that to be done. The Sneaky Kitty Game shooter tutorials also go through this, but there's a weird quirk, and this speaks back to why we didn't duplicate this, because you can now see what you would have had to do for this. For every single anim layer base that you would have, anim layer that's included in this layer base. So you'll see what we have to do here and why we didn't do it. Okay, so if we look now, again, this is just the duplicated procedural layer from the other, from the Sneaky Kitty Game Shooter Framework example project. There are some issues here. You'll see some warnings. That's okay. We haven't done anything with the skeleton yet. We need to do something to the skeleton to get this to read some of these variables. We'll do that in a minute. Or if you've already done that with the Sneaky Kitty Game Shooter tutorials and you know how to do that, then we need to do that. So we'll do that in a second. But the primary thing I want to show you is that the old anim layer interface is still being referenced here. So if we want to delete this, it will transfer. So let's try that, right? So if we want to delete this, it'll say, would you like to transfer the interface functions to be a part of the blueprint? If we say yes, it will transfer this over, okay, but the interface will be gone, and when we want to bring in our new interface, we can't have the same procedural anim layer twice in this blueprint. So what we want to do here is we want to just grab everything that's in here and Control-C, copy it, go back to class settings, delete this, and say no. Now it's gone, okay? And so now when we add in the interface, okay, which is for my game, you'll see we get back to having the animation layer, but it's empty. And so just copy, and so we already copied it, so just Control V, everything back in. And now we need to find that little output input pose node and output pose node, and we need to hook these up. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so those are hooked up. So I'm going to compile. I'm still going to have the warnings, and all these warnings have to do with um, virtual bones we don't have on our skeleton yet, unless you've done the SneakyKitty game shooter framework tutorials on how to set up the skeleton and you're ahead on that step. So that's what we need to do now. Okay. So to get rid of these warnings, we need to come back to our skeleton and set up the virtual bones that are required. You can find this information on the SneakyKitty Games shooter tutorials that are on YouTube, or on the Discord there's a pinned post that has the text file for this information. But let's go ahead and set it up here if you haven't done that based on the tutorials. The tutorials I highly recommend. The setup tutorials are super helpful and critical to understanding how to set this framework up. I'm just going over how to get the skeleton set up so we can move forward here. Okay, so the primary ones that we need to have set up for all of this to work, to get rid of the warnings that we're getting and to get the procedurals to work, are the ones we're set up now. Let's start with the ones that go onto the head. Okay, so there's a virtual bone that needs to be here. So add this virtual bone, and it goes from head to head. Okay, that's how virtual bones work. And we're going to call this one IK handgun parent. And this will be the parent for all the rest of the virtual bones. And then from this parent bone, we need to add another virtual bone that goes from handgun parent, which is where we are now, to the head. And this one we're going to call IK handgun ADS. So IK handgun ADS. That's for aim down sights, obviously. And the last one we need to add goes from the parent to IK handgun, which is a bone on the skeleton already. So you can just look up IK handgun here. Oops, if you can spell hand. Okay, handgun, right? And this we want to call IK handgun. Okay, so we need those virtual bones there, and if we want firearm collision, which we do eventually, from one of the spine bones, and in the tutorial he makes it clear that it can be any of these spine bones. Well, it could be almost any bone, but these spine bones tend to be the best bones. And he sets it up on spine 01, so we'll set it up on the same spine bone, but we need to create another virtual bone that goes from spine, whatever you're using. Okay, so add bone from spine 1, which is where we're starting, to spine 1 to the same bone. And this virtual bone we're going to call firearm collision. Okay, so that's our firearm collision hand bone. Okay, or bone. Okay, so now all of these virtual bones are added, and it's important that you add those first before we do the next step. So the next step has to do with the settings for this layered blend per bone. Right now you can see it's a blend mask, and that blend mask is is embedded in Lyra. It comes with Lyra, upper body, lower body split mask. But the procedurals for SKG shooter framework have another kind of are optimized for a different blend mask with different settings potentially. So let's go ahead and make the blend mask that he recommends that we use. So going back to the skeleton, you can go to create asset, and if you go to oh no, sorry, is it, where is it? No, sorry, it's here under this. It's blend profiles, add blend mask. So we're going to add a blend mask here, all right? And this blend mask we're going to call FPS procedurals. Just something that you know, you can remember what it is and what it's related to. So from there, we're going to basically uh, take, we're going to set some settings on here that are going to allow us to kind of isolate bones within the skeleton for the procedurals. You know, instead of doing a split by a particular bone, we can actually tune the weights of these bones. So what we're going to do is we're going to set IK handgun to 1, and then right click on it and recursively set all the children of that to 1 as well. Okay, and we're going to do the same exact thing for spine 1. Set all of those to 1. The reason we did in this order is because we needed to create the virtual bones so they can get this setting. If you create the virtual bones after the blend mask, then you need to go back and redo this step. So, but making sure that all of these have 1. Okay. So that's our new blend mask. So we'll save that. Okay, great. So now that we have the virtual bones that we need and the blend mask set up the way we need to have it set up, if we go back to the procedural SKG procedural anim layer and we recompile, you'll see we get no errors, right? Because we now have the virtual bones that the procedural layers require to function properly. Okay, so that's good. So now we're one step closer to getting there. So just making sure that our input and output nodes are indeed are hooked up, which is good. Okay, so now when we come back here, because we set up the anim layer interface and we now have the anim layer interface now linked to the correct procedural anim layer animBP, and our item anim layers base also has that if we need to bring this in here and use this. Since those are all connected together in that chain, we can now drag this off here and bring it into our animBP. So let me just delete the ones I had before, just show you. So boom, here it is. Okay. So, and everything should compile fine with that not hooked up, no problem. And what I do here, and I think you can eventually not have this specifically referencing this instance of this class, but I do it to start off with, at least because I know that it forces it, is I have it go ahead and look for the exact procedural anim layer instance that we just set up. Okay, so I just make sure that instance class is set to the one we just set up here. Okay, so I can compile that. Great. Okay, so now we have the basis for what we need here, and if we looked back at the other animBP that comes with the SneakyKitty game shooter tutorial, you'll notice that the top part here is kind of the same thing as what is set up there, which is say locomotion and all that stuff is coming into the lower body, and then the upper body stuff is coming in through here, right? But you know, we don't we have this other stuff down here which is all new to Lyra, and so we're going to set this up in a way that is for now very simple just to get it working, and then we'll come back at some point and set up our own linked anim layers that choose layers the way that Lyra does it in a more sophisticated way, using linked anim layers that are related to every one of the weapon types. But for now, to get it set up, let's just do the required work of getting a pose for aiming that is related to this skeleton and set that up through the upper body. Okay, so yeah, so the first thing we need to do is create, again, this is all in the SneakyKitty game shooter framework tutorials, so if you've already gone through that, you'll recognize this next step. But let's just assume that we're going to be equipping and holding on to a rifle from the very beginning. And so what we need is we need a base pose that we can feed into the procedurals that we can then use as a starting point for how our procedurals are going to operate and what they're going to operate on. All right. So, like, let's just, for instance, take this and let's just go ahead and plug it in instead of the locomotion node here. Let's disconnect that. Okay, let's plug that in here. All right. Let's take this and plug that in here um, as a starting point. Uh, so there's no input coming into here, right? So we need to have an input, otherwise we're going to get nothing here. And if we run right now, what are we going to get when we do this? Right? We're going to get a T-pose because we don't have anything happening for the upper body. Okay, and we're going to get an error, kind of, reading in the log. Okay, so we're not there yet, but that's okay. We'll get there. So what we need to do now then is back in our anim layers base is we need to feed a pose um, into this node for it to work. Okay, so it has to have something coming in to operate on. There's nothing in there now. Okay, so what we're going to use for that is we're going to go back to our Lyra directory, and in the animations layer, you'll see under locomotion we have different layers for different weapons. And this is something that SneakyKitty Games Shooter Frameworks workflow kind of forces from the very beginning, which is a good thing. It forces us to use specific animations for the various for the various weapons, because this is a first-person game, and your hands and arms position in animations for first-person shooter are so obvious to you that you want a specific animation for every single game. So come from a workflow where you've just reused animations over and over again and then tweaked little things to get them to work. SneakyKitty Games Shooter Framework pushes you away from that and pushes you more towards the final end product workflow right from the beginning. So we need an animation pose for whatever weapon we're going to use, and we need one per weapon. But we're going to start off with a kind of generic one to begin with, and then we'll tweak it as we need it. So let's go back here and look at finding the rifle idle hipfire animation. So if we find this animation here and we open it, okay, you'll see it's just kind of idling there and doing its thing, which is fine. This is going to be the kind of base pose for the procedural anim layers that we're going to use. So I'm going to stop this. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this animation, right? So I'm going to go back to the content browser, and I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to call this idle fire hip fire, and I'm just going to call this my game. For now, you would end up naming this the gun or the rifle or the object that your procedurals are operating on, but for now I'm just going to call it my game. I'm going to open it, and we want this to not be a multi-frame animation. We want this to be a single frame animation. So I need to strip out all the rest of the frames from this, so I can do that by so let's do first, let's do one thing. So let's get this here, right? Okay, and we need to figure out what weapon we're going to use and how the IK handgun is oriented to this animation per weapon. So we will do that in a second, but for now let's just strip out all the information for this, and then we'll tweak this gun and keyframe it where we want it. But for now, I'm just going to add a keyframe here as a start. Okay, I'm going to keyframe that bone. With that bone selected, I'm keyframing it. Okay, and then I'm going to take all of the frames from 1 to 251 and remove them. Okay, so now I have a single frame animation with one key for the IK handgun, and we can rekey bone to suit where and how our weapon is going to be held by that hand. But for now, that single frame animation we can use as the basis for our primary pose for the procedurals. Okay, so I'm going to save that. So back in our NMBP, I'm going to take that animation. If I go to animation asset browser, we can just search for by game, and we have that one animation. We can bring it in, and again, this is just to get things up and running. We can plug that in and compile. Okay, and now this animation is running into the upper body for this thing, and we can change this layered blend per bone over to our blend mask. Okay, so now that animation runs through the procedurals. The procedurals then operate from that input pose through all of the procedural animation data that's coming through the anim layer that we just linked, and then flowing back out into the upper body slot, then being layered together with everything that's happening on the lower body to then come through and produce the rest of this. And we're going to change all of this stuff in a second, but let's go ahead and just see what happens with that. So now you can see that my arms are in the quote-unquote right position, okay, but you know, not everything is kind of working just yet. So our camera's there. It's not really doing much of anything yet, so we need to fix that. Okay. Okay, so let's look back at the Lyra NMBP base to see what is happening down here and what we need to keep and what we don't want to keep and where we need to put it. In general, what we don't want is anything that is affecting the root bone in any way. Otherwise, we will have problems with jerking and stopping and starting in our upper body when we're trying to move and the procedurals are operating. And we don't need anything in Lyra that's doing any kind of aiming, because that's not something that we're going to be doing with Lyra anymore. So the first thing we can do is just remove this out of here, right? So we don't need any of this because this is full body aiming and full body additives, okay? And this node here, I'm going to move it where it needs to. I'm going to move these things where they need to go and then explain why they need to go there. But basically what we don't want to have happen is we don't want to have any of the root bone or things that are going to shift the body in any way happening on the upper body, okay, in order to get smooth procedural aiming. We want all that stuff to potentially operate on the lower body so that our lower body, when perceived by both ourselves and other characters, seem to be doing the right thing, but they don't want to be affecting how we're aiming, etc. Okay, so we're going to get rid of, we're going to move some of these and get rid of these things. So we're getting rid of this, and we're going to take these two nodes and we're going to move them upwards in the chain. So I'm going to take this and isolate those, and I'm going to move these upward in the chain. So where am I going to move these? I'm going to move these just after we apply our additives, okay? But before we apply, just after we do our locomotion, but before we apply our procedurals, all right? So after coming out of locomotion, I'm going to go ahead and put my inertialization node there, come back into apply additive, okay? So there. And then from apply additive, I'm going to go and modify the root bone relative to the turn in place, since we want turn in place to be perceived by both ourselves and other characters. And this inertialization node is going to go here, and the rotate root bone is going to go here. So you can see this is the new chain. Locomotion, inertialization, apply additive, rotate root bone happens there. All right. And then we need to continue through with this. So all of this is now being cached here after it gets blended together. So that cache here needs to follow through. And we do want full body skeletal controls, okay, but we don't want, we'll get into this in a second, there's something we need to do here. But let's go ahead and connect all this back up together, bypassing the aiming stuff from Lyra, and compile that. Okay, so now we'll see a couple things that we'll need to change here in order for the weapon to work in here. And the control rig we can talk about as well. You can keep this control rig here, but you need to modify it if you want to. And that's a choice you need to make as a game designer, and we'll talk about that choice and with the implications of that. But let's go back here and let's test. Right. So now my body is rotating. You can see it's rotating, and everything is kind of operating. But what I'm not getting is I'm not getting the spine to change, right? The spine is not um, uh, bending down when I'm looking yet. Okay, but you can see my spine is rotating. So we want the spine to bend downward and do the procedural bending as well as turning, and that has to do with the animation blueprint and the procedurals here. But the issue is that we need to get information from the camera and its orientation to the procedural layers here, and that's done through the SneakyKitty Games shooter pawn component that comes with the plugin. So I need to add that to the character in order for the character, for the camera information to get to the correct AnimBP layers and get that information about this rotation. So once you add the SKG shooter pawn to your character, you'll see that there's an initialize tab that has initial information that you need to add to this about your character. This is again also included in all of the SneakyKitty Games shooter tutorials, so you'll be familiar with that if you've gone through those not in a non-Lyra context. And so we don't need to link the anim class layers here. We do need to make sure that one of our character meshes that we're using is the same name as this one. At least one of these needs to be named this, so I just leave it at default, that's fine. And our camera component in this case has to have the name that it has in our character, so FPS camera in our case is the name. The camera is attached to this socket which we created already in the skeleton, and make sure that name is the same. And so once we do that, okay, and compile this and go back to shooter pawn, go back to the to play the game. What I'm going to do here now, and I've already done this, set it up, is I'm going to switch to 2 players and on listen server so I can see this in replicated mode, and I'm just doing it in the new editor so that we can have both windows open. And if I go ahead and play, you'll see that I'm going to move this character away. So my hands look a little wonky right now, and there's a reason for that, because I did something offline that'll show you what I did, but they look like they're not in the pose of the rifle, so don't worry about that. I'll show you that in a second. But you can also see that now my spine bends in all directions, relative to the thing. So obviously it's tweaking the spine. The character mesh is stretching, but that's a consequence of the turn in place limits and your character mesh and the skin weighting. So that's a whole other issue that needs to be solved and tuned later, but we're not going to get into that. But you can see that the spine is rotating, and now we're aiming procedurally with the spine. And we do have a true first-person perspective. We can see our feet in the client window above. And when we look down at our feet, all that stuff is replicated. Okay, so that's where we stand now. So great. So let's stop that, close those windows, and let me go back and show you what I did to get the hands in the position they're in now. Okay, so if we look back at the SneakyKitty Games example content, so this is in the SneakyKitty Games shooter framework example content, we look at the AnimBP from that example project, you'll see that in the primary AnimBP, there are a few nodes that are required for the IK on the weapon. Okay, so those nodes are happening after the procedurals are being applied to the upper body, but um, before there's this extra right-hand slot. We'll get into that later. But just after all the procedurals are done, and the final thing in the chain is to apply the IK bone positions for this. So what you need to do is you need to take those and copy them. Okay, so just copy them. Go back. If we go back to your anim layer BP, your base layer BP, the primary animation base. If you're not familiar with this, if you double click on this, you're going to get to nothing. Okay, and that's okay. Don't freak out and don't connect these. All right, because all of that means is that you're referencing some other layer in your anim layer space, and the item anim layer that we're referencing in that is full body skeletal controls, right? So that was back here, full body skeletal controls. That's here in item anim layers base. So in this, what we need to do is we want to remove from the vanilla Lyra this copy bone after hand IK retargeting. This copy bone needs to get removed. You can see that it's operating on the bone that Lyra uses for weapon aiming, and Lyra is third person, and that bone is attached to the skeleton of the character, and so it's a little bit faking aiming. We're not faking aiming anymore. Our aiming is going to be procedurally precise. So this bone needs to go away. I have it broken out just above where it used to be. These two bone IKs, hand R, hand L, two bone IKs, need to get removed from the chain. Those are removed. So we're going from hand IK to transform modify bone to foot placement to leg IK, and then after foot placement and leg IK are good to go, then we've already copied those in, right? So then we just paste those. Oops, that must be from some previous paste. We copied these things, which I already did, right? So copied those, and then I just pasted those here, okay? So those are those three nodes here. So I already did that. So those three nodes go here, and then finally they go into this transform modify bone at the end of the chain. This particular transform modify bone is literally just scaling down the weapon when you're doing things that you want the weapon to disappear, but you don't want to destroy the weapon. And so that's what's happening here. Okay, so for instance, like you're climbing a ladder and you don't want the weapon in your hand, but you don't want to see it anymore, but you don't want to destroy the actor because it's in your inventory and the equipment manager is managing it. You would scale it down. That's how Lyra operates with that. So it scales the bone that's attached to down. We can change all that later if we need to, but for now it's fine. Leave it there. Okay, so now that that's all good to go, that's why when we play back in the level, you'll see the hands in a weird position. So the base pose for those hands is the Lyra animation. Is the Lyra rifle pose that we used, but now the hands are being snapped to some kind of arbitrary spot, not related to a weapon per se, but rather where the IK handgun bone is, and the left hand doesn't have anywhere to snap, so it defaults back to that IK handgun. You can see they're overlapping in the same space. Okay. So that's that. So there's all of the procedural stuff for the animation kind of implemented in the AnimBP, and for the most part, largely we've overcome a lot of the impediments of Lyra's animation blueprint to get the procedural stuff we need. We'll talk about the control rig in the next series, and we'll talk about getting the weapon set up as well. So I'll see you in the next tutorial, and we'll deal with the weapon, and then we'll deal with the implications of what it means to have the control rig here as we go forward. And we'll set up our first gameplay ability, which will be aim down sights. Okay, thanks.